And
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the 7th strategic webinar in the EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum series, in which we discuss how to build back better European aviation after COVID-19. I'm Philip Hughes, Head of Stakeholder Management in EUROCONTROL, and today we'd like to look at the air cargo sector, which is currently one of the only areas in aviation which is holding its own. It does, however, face some unique challenges to maintain its growth, particularly given the age profile of the fleet and the future sustainability challenges that it raises. Cargo operations have continued to fly throughout the pandemic, carrying vital supplies and now vaccines, with all cargo operations in Europe frequently the only market segment above pre-COVID levels. But even with global passenger flights massively down, and with all the lost cargo capacity that entails, air cargo measured in cargo tons per kilometre is now approaching the level seen before the pandemic. This, of course, is helped by the greater optimisation of existing freighters and the use of passenger aircraft for cargo-only flights. So, As we prepare for recovery and building back better, we take a closer look at this vital market segment and explore the role that new generation technologies can play in making future cargo operations more efficient, more sustainable, while maintaining the highest level of safety. So our panel today will tackle the big issues for cargo, the big questions, which was how technology will impact and shape future cargo operations in flight. What is the potential for electric and autonomous technology in producing new, greener and more efficient ways of flying? What are the challenges that need to be addressed to deliver this technological transformation? And how can innovative organizations work together to promote sustainable technologies in the cargo industry? So today we've assembled a panel of innovative thinkers from leading aviation organizations who will help us to build a clearer picture on the future development. So we have Hugh Flynn, who's a board director of ASL Aviation Holdings, one of the biggest cargo organizations in the world. We've Eric Orr Lindberg, co-founder and executive chairman of Vertigo Aero based in the US. We have also Charles Tavener, who's the executive chairman of FlyLogix. So the format of the thing today will be that each of the three panelists will give us a 5-minute presentation on their perspective on how they see things developing. And then we will then move forward to a question and answer session, which you will be able to ask your own questions through the Q&A facility on the WebEx. If you have any problems, you're experiencing issues, please use the chat function. And we will be able to get to your questions, hopefully in that way. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over, first of all, to Hugh Flynn to kick off the first presentation. Hugh, the floor is yours.
Philip, thanks very much indeed for that very informed introduction. And if I may, excuse me, on behalf of the Cargo Vision Forum, thank EUROCONTROL for allowing us to have this webinar. And we hope that everybody will enjoy it and be able to take something away from it. Two things I'd really focus around. One is a little bit on the cargo side about ourselves, about ASL Group and what the group does. So if I can go to the next page, please. Global aviation provider is what it's all about. We have 6 airlines operating on 7 continents all over the globe. We're always neutral. By that we mean we fly for different mainly express and e-commerce agents throughout Europe. This is a European-based business, essentially. We're stable. We've got a very strong record of financial performance, but most importantly for our clients, a very strong operational and reliability legacy. Innovation and flexibility. I think you'll see we've been very customer driven in that area. We've started off with all sorts of funny airplanes flying in Europe. We had 2 Hercules flying express cargo for several years. We were first to get into the A300 operations for a big integrator, and then another integrator, and the first to operate 737-400s around Europe. So really what it tells us lastly is we cargo focused and using our scale and assets to deliver for those expectations. Fleet size today, I must say, is around 130 aircraft, and I've got a comment on the 13 aircraft types. When we started off with a company called Air Contractors in Ireland back in '97, the authority said to us, please don't come near us, because I think we had a total fleet of about 12 airplanes, but we had 5 different types. Nothing's changed. We still do lots of types, but that is to satisfy our customers' demand. About 3,000 team members, ranging from pilots to engineers to administration and so forth. And as I said earlier, global operations, mainly in Europe, but also North America, Asia, Oceania, Africa, and Antarctica. The fleet types, as I say, quite extensive. At the top end, the large end, the 747s, 75s, A330s, the different variants there, A300s, 737s, just recently into the 800 freighters, traditionally with a classic, previous to that, the 300s and now the 400s, series of ATRs, and we're still blessed with a few Hercules aircraft doing great work in Africa for the aid agencies. We also do quite a bit of passenger flying, but not too much at the moment, as we all know. Then about cargo vision. Most importantly, that's the discussion for today. So together with leading technology companies, we developed a forum in late 2020, and we called it Cargo Vision. The objective of this Cargo Vision is to help raise awareness of ASL and our forum members, the position around innovation and new technologies, sustainability, with a focus on air cargo operations. So a lot of that has to do with communication, and we're busy establishing an online presence both on the social media side and also on the digital platform side for online presence. So the last thing I just wanted to touch base on quickly was the forum members that we have. Apart from ourselves, there's Reliable Robotics out of the US, there's Pipistrel in Europe, there's Universal Hydrogen in Canada, Vertigo Aero, which we'll hear from Eric in a few minutes, FlyLogic, similarly from Charles Tavener, Magnix, and eAviation. So thank you very much. That's just the introduction, my first 5 minutes, Philip.
Thanks, Hugh. That's great. And what's interesting, I think, about Cargo Vision is the way in which it's a worldwide initiative, I think, to look at some of these things. So without further ado, I ask Eric to take the floor. First of all, I'd particularly like to thank Eric for joining us on the West Coast at such an early hour for him. So thanks again, Eric. So just handing over to you.
Thanks, Philip and Hugh. Can you see my presentation now? There we go.
Going through.
So my grandfather, as a young airmail pilot, had an inspiration. He wanted to show the world that aviation could be used for commercial purposes. And that inspiration, coupled with, I can't advance my slides. How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Coupled with risk management and determination, obviously created a radical shift in the way the world saw aviation. In fact, before my grandfather flew across the Atlantic, people who flew in airplanes were called barnstormers and daredevils. And after he flew across the Atlantic, people who flew in airplanes were called pilots and passengers. And that ushered in the long distance air transportation industry that we all sort of know and understand today. As we approach the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's flight, the Lindbergh Foundation partnered up with the X Prize Foundation, and we're asking the question, how do you make flight infinitely sustainable? For the short term, true net zero carbon aviation, and in the long term, zero carbon aviation. And right now we're building the brain trust to identify the issues to work on, influence prize design, prize philanthropy, to help accelerate that change, the standards, targets, education, and more. And you can just contact me afterwards if you're interested in participating in this alliance. On the 75th anniversary, I retraced my grandfather's flights across the Atlantic in a small single-engine aircraft. And the question then was how to promote the future of flight, which I saw as in space flight. And it worked. I survived the flight, flew nonstop from New York to Paris. And today we have Blue Origin, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, all vying to sell you tickets to fly into space and send cargo, if you consider a Tesla, sending a Tesla to the sun cargo. But to be a part of a small team of people who got Spaceship One hanging in the Air and Space Museum next to the Spirit of St. Louis was incredibly empowering. And I'm not really a rocket scientist, so I set my sights back on aviation. And this journey will lead somewhere, I promise. I really saw the threats to aviation and thought, how do we address that? Can we use prize philanthropy? So I started giving prizes for development in electric flight. And then in 2017, that led to two partners and I starting Vertigo Aero. So the premise of electrification in flight is really to reduce emissions, cost, and noise. Those are the main threats that we see to the aviation industry in general. and enable new markets. The challenge for electrification is getting enough energy on board for useful missions, regulatory compliance, and safety reserves, because batteries just aren't there yet in terms of energy density. And we think we've solved that with our VH3 185 hybrid power plant that can operate in multiple modes, both in as a series hybrid and parallel hybrid applications. And what that enables is aircraft designers to come up with different airframes that can tackle new markets. And so we've got 4 customers here on this slide. XTI Trifan 200 is at eVTOL, that's aimed at the military cargo market. And then Airflow is an eSTOL, electric short takeoff and landing, designed to take off in 300 feet or maybe off the top of a cargo warehouse for commercial logistics. The Jaunt hybrid is an eVTOL passenger carrying aircraft. And we're actually working on a heavy cargo aircraft with our propulsion system that I can't really share publicly. So I put this funny little placeholder in there. But 3 out of those 4 customers that we have are focused on the cargo market. So we compare well against existing propulsion and electric propulsion. We have 4 to 7 times more energy than all electric battery designs. 40% less fuel burn and emissions than competing turbine designs. And in terms of infrastructure, we can burn Jet A or SAF, and you don't need grid level improvements to airports or vertiports around a city in order to go to scale. So we have low operating cost and compliance as well, and we can get into that in the questions and answers. Love this photo of our early days with our Iron Bird. We're based down at Daytona Beach, Florida, co-located with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And I just like to leave you with one thought, and that is, as we move into this discussion and how electrification, will affect cargo flying, imagine flying from New York to Paris in 2027, in 6 short years, in an electric aircraft. I want to go there. Love to take you with me. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That's really interesting. I suppose what comes across there is how quickly aviation has progressed in such a relatively short time. But it's a really exciting time and a really interesting journey. So, Charles, over to you now to talk about UAVs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Philip, and thanks to the team at EUROCONTROL. So just wait for the slides to come up. Thanks. If we step to the first slide, at FlyLogix, we have a bold vision for a centrally controlled European-wide unmanned freight network using smaller, more frequent aircraft to deliver what we describe internally as a flying conveyor belt. But we think that is only possible working in very tight coordination with the ANSPs, because what that cannot do is restrict existing air users, all of the activity that's going on at the moment, which, as Philip points out, is growing in this space. It needs to complement the type of activity Hugh is talking about. So it's working with those larger manned aircraft moving between central hubs. And of course, it needs to exploit the types of carbon abatement technologies that Eric is talking about. So if we step on to the next slide, I think no discussion about the use of unmanned in freight really can go forward without actually talking about what the challenges are. And we've been operating long-range unmanned aircraft since 2009, and that gives us insight into why that is difficult. So the first thing about that vision that I described to you is that requires a massive scale out of infrastructure and operational capability on day one to be of any value. It obviously requires flexible, safe access to airspace without restricting all the good work that's going on around it. And there's a fundamental thing, which is if I want to use smaller aircraft, the economics of logistics mean that there must be a higher degree of autonomy. Even if I've got the same pool of talented pilots and things managing that, there's going to be a higher degree of autonomy to make that work. So we step on one more slide. What we see is that you can't go straight to that sort of, my team call it drone nirvana. You've got to go through an intermediate stage. And what we see is a higher value unmanned logistics service servicing the energy industry, where there's a near-term opportunity to build part of that network today. And we're already working with, for example, one of the biggest drilling contractors in the world, Transocean, on this. And what that allows us to do is it operates in a lower density maritime or more remote areas. So that makes that an easier safety case. It allows us to use air structures like transponder mandatory zones before we have kind of wide scale adoption of full electronic conspicuity. And typically these are known traffic environments where we've got a more limited set of professional aviation users operating, which means that we can get a service up and running more quickly. So on the back of that, what we have done at FlyLogix is we focused on delivering real services today. So as we speak, we are delivering long-range commercial services to customers like BP, Equinor, Shell, Total, TAQA, Chrysaor. That's predominantly conducting methane emission operations. So the picture on the right-hand side shows one of our aircraft operating around a facility just on the boundary between Norway and the UK. These are typically 300 nautical mile round trips from a variety of different locations. And that concept of operations requires tight integration with the ANSP, which in this instance is NATS, to deliver a reliable, safe service. So if we come to the final slide, we just turn our eye back to where we want to go, to that cargo world. So we have already conducted the first airport-to-airport delivery in the United Kingdom. Later this year, we will put in a twice daily service. And what we're doing there is we're delivering high-value goods to a particularly isolated community. We focused in a well-constrained area, so between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, where we've got a better, more known traffic environment. And again, very, very similar to the previous one, we're working in tight coordination with an ASP, in this case, Land's End Airport, in order to deliver that. So what I wanted to get across in those few slides is this is actually happening today. There are real operations of this nature going on, and the skill is plotting that very deliberate path to, as I call it, unmanned nirvana. Thanks very much, Philip.
Thanks, Charles. That's definitely a phrase I'm going to take away now from this webinar, is drone nirvana. That's a very good one. But it's very interesting to see a practical example of how UAVs are already been used practically for commercial applications. And I think this, again, it's a sign that things are moving on very rapidly. So perhaps I could turn to Hugh, first of all, just going back to the whole issue of cargo vision. Obviously, the cargo industry probably has a challenge. To go back to your analysis of your fleet, there's quite a few old ones, including the few Hercules. So what's cargo vision? How do you support the achievement, for instance, of decarbonisation? How do you see that evolving? Is cargo going to lead the charge, or are they going to be behind it, or how do you see that developing?
I think first of all, Philip, you know, if you ask a man in the street and you say, which airplane will fly on a sustainable basis and autonomously, would it be cargo or passengers? I mean, we all know it's going to be cargo. So we have a massive responsibility to step up to the plate, particularly in Europe. And, you know, we are supporting the European Destination 2050 to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. What the airlines are saying is we should try and get to 2030 and be halfway there. So, you know, you alluded to something earlier on. You said, oh, we're just 6 years away from, you know, I think actually it was Eric, you're 6 years away from this. We're 9 years away from 2030. You know, things are happening, need to happen really quickly. So in terms of the the EU initiative, I mean, there are 4 things we focus on. Obviously, SAF is one. Another one is aircraft technology. The third one is economic measures. And then in your domain, say your domain, it's all of ours, but you oversee it, is EUROCONTROL, the air traffic management side of things. So, I'll expand on that a little bit further as we go along, but that's really, to answer your question, where we focused.
Okay. So, Eric, if I go back to talking about the propulsion systems and the piece with electric, what do you think the potential for electric and autonomous technology in producing new and greener forms of flight? Do you think do you see that as particularly a bridging technology in the near term? How do you see it being able to impact or help aviation to decarbonize?
Yeah, I think electric propulsion is the wave of the future, and eventually it will reach its way up to airline transport category aircraft. But it starts with smaller aircraft and ones that will have an higher L over D or lift over drag, so more efficient aircraft first.
Mm-hmm.
We see ourselves as a bridge technology because the energy density of batteries is really not there yet. We got involved about 13 years ago and really looked at it and saw that this was likely to develop just like the automotive industry. You saw the GM EV1 electric car come out, and then you saw Toyota come out with the Prius. Really, hybrids dominated the market for about 20 years before Tesla came along, and now we're seeing a lot more electric cars. We're seeing the same thing in aviation. We're mass constrained and batteries aren't there yet. So we see the hybrid technology with our diesel propulsion systems being that bridge, and it's future proofed, if you will. As soon as the batteries come along that are 700 to 800 watt hours per kilogram with enough energy density on board to fly robust commercial missions during peak traffic times, then you can take the engine out and put all batteries in there once that technology is ready and you've got the operational data sets and all the technology is very matured. So that's sort of our return on investment, our value proposition. Thank you.
But I think it's fair to say it's really dependent on the evolution of battery technology itself. And in some senses, it's dependent on other industries, I presume, in terms of how they're all. So it's all coming out of the same stream. So what's your view in terms of the technological pipeline in terms of innovation? Do you think 5 years' time we'll have doubled the capacity, or what's the current thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in 3 years' time we're going to see the first sort of certified commercial missions going out, and we're going to see that rapidly move from in 5 years' time a multi-million dollar industry growing quickly to 2030 when we see it being a multi-billion dollar industry. So it moves very quickly, and it scales. Although we're really focused on the sub-megawatt, so smaller aircraft to begin with.
Okay, very good. So Charles, I have a question here from Julie Garland in Navtrain. She says, how long do you think it'll be before we see unmanned aircraft used to carry cargo from specifically designed hubs?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So to what I was talking about earlier, I mean, we are starting to see unmanned aviation moving freight between existing airports. We will have a twice daily service into the Scillies later this year. And I guess by the nature of that, I mean, we are close. We are probably on those specific cases, those particular early adoption cases. I would expect that to be happening in the next few years, Philip.
Okay, very interesting. So it's quite imminent. And in terms of the actual changes to the infrastructure, just leading on that, how do you see the infrastructure at airports developing, or are they bespoke cargo terminals, or is it a mix of both? Or
I guess we've worked very hard to fit in. And so a lot of the nature of the scale of the type of operation we're doing and the size of the aircraft, the requirements of the aircraft, is they tend to be less demanding than their larger manned, their sort of big brother, big sister, and so they can fit in relatively easily. And then we work very hard to make sure that we can mobilize our own infrastructure into more remote places where that stuff is not in place. So it's not a significant barrier. The main barrier, Philip, is just about finding the use cases where it offers value in the near term. That's the challenge.
Okay. So Hugh, just going back to cargo vision and the kind of identifying the key enablers in order to make this happen. Obviously, we're talking about UAVs and propulsion systems. What other elements do cargo vision seeing as being a key enabler in order to, shall we say, to advance this this particular vision about how cargo can evolve?
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the key areas we looked at. Well, we've been talking about aircraft technology, and economic measures are two examples I can give. And words that yourself and Eric used earlier was, what are we doing in the intermediate stage or as a bridge? And I think there as well, and with respect to aircraft technology, electric and or hydrogen propulsion is something relevant for the current airplanes we operate. Perhaps more, definitely at the smaller turboprop end, where there are advancements, apart from what we hear from the great Airbuses and Boeings and what have you. There are people, certainly in our forum, that are keen to see solutions in the nearer term. And your question would be, so again, when? And the when there, I think, not putting words in their mouth, but hopefully we can talk about this at another occasion, webinar, and that is probably within the next 5 years, we'll have something to come up with. And we're very much working as a group, to answer your question, as a forum, to find ways of working these airplanes of ours on taking a green time, almost run out aircraft and trialing it, whether it be aircraft technology with electric and hydrogen, or on the other hand, or combined with that, the autonomous or semi-autonomous side of operating the existing type airplanes. Because if we sit and wait for 2030 for brand new revolutionary types of propulsion and aircraft types, I'm not sure, I don't think anybody's sure that the cargo can bear the cost of flying that kind of expensive equipment around. But things will change, and perhaps it can happen. But if we look at Europe and the discussions about Europe on some of our 737s, Airbuses even, you're doing probably 120, and on the turboprop side, maybe 70 hours a month, which is, from a capital cost point of view, makes it very, very difficult. So again, the pressure's on us as a group to come up with a solution that would allow a higher capital, more expensive airplane to perhaps be used. But lots have to happen before we get into that kind of thinking. So again, I think we have to look very carefully at the bridge, the intermediate side of things.
And just in terms of that issue, in terms of the investment profile, given the relatively low level of hours flown by cargo aircraft, it must become difficult to make that investment case in terms of buying new, more efficient aircraft. And do you see the kind of, for instance, the move towards UAVs and so on as a kind of a way in which it can become more efficient? How does that business case work from the cargo industry?
I think, again, as I said earlier, we work for a number of the very large global express agents companies. And I think from that point of view, from a regulatory point of view, from an OEM point of view, we need to see what the stakeholder requirements are going to be. And I think, what are their demands in terms of, if we go specifically to our clients, what are their demands going to be? They're going to look at cost, they're going to look at convenience, speed, all of those kind of things. Some of the points you raised, airport the fundamentals around airport
infrastructure,
infrastructure, GSE. In fact, one of our clients is actually doing eGSE at the moment, so they've made a big step forward there already. And the other clients that are working on SAF. But I think it's very important that we listen intently to what the needs of those customers are, and vice versa. That's where Cargo Vision comes in. We talk to them. We've got a channel open where we keep talking backwards and forwards to our clients, and similarly to the forum holders. And the forum can talk directly to the customers as well. But it's to try and encourage this, as I said right in the beginning, encourage this initiative of exchange of information. And I'm sure, looking at things like the intermediate bridging side, we'll get to something before things become great in terms of new generation types of airplanes.
So, Eric, just going back to your planned flight to Europe in 2027, I don't know if you're selling any seats on it, but I'd certainly be interested. But on the issue of safety, I mean, if I'm flying across the Atlantic, safety would be foremost in my mind, shall we say, in terms of what that might mean. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of the safety and perhaps some of the regulatory issues you think might arise in terms of electric aircraft.
Sure. Well, I think anytime you introduce a new technology, you're going to see those barriers. I actually noticed a question on the chat, question about how China, Russia, other countries that aren't looking at low emissions aircraft are going to proceed in this market. And I think, we need to do that. And the companies that do that will have an economic advantage, and that will take over, and the marketplace will run it. In terms of the regulatory side, we feel like we have a big advantage. We're working with the FAA on certification now, so we're in that process, and it's a long and costly process for anyone that's in the aviation industry. This. One of the things that we've heard from our industry, specifically the eVTOL industry, all electric, all battery approaches to this market, are that maybe they could waive the safety reserve requirements because you can do a vertical landing somewhere. And I think the FAA doesn't have any real incentive to lower the safety standards for aviation, because those regulations were written in blood. And I think, as we've seen with recent accidents, there is absolutely no case, I think, where they will actually loosen those until we have perhaps hundreds of thousands or millions of hours of data, operational data sets that will they loosen those things. So we feel like we have an advantage in terms of propulsion, because we can put in a little bit more fuel and have full reserves, plus do 4 or 5 missions within a city before we have to go out and refuel at an existing fueling operation, or use a fuel truck for that. So I think the question about rules and regulations, I think we have to fit into the existing ones or be safer. We can't ever really go back down in safety.
And I presume that in terms of building the safety case, it's incremental in terms of, as Charles was talking about earlier, he would use the UAVs in maritime environments, which are safety, and then build the safety case incrementally on that, I presume.
I agree. I think these markets will expand organically, and Charles and Flylogix, they're doing it already. They're showing us the case. It's going to take a lot of that before people are comfortable with unmanned aircraft, for example, flying in and landing on top of a building in the city.
Yeah.
And the people, I think the other piece that will be regulatory are the public. The public doesn't like to hear lots of angry bees, like a hive of angry bees above their head.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have low noise aircraft to be able to operate in those more congested areas. And that's going to be a real differentiator as well.
Okay. Charles, just on the UAV side then, the Gunnar Schwach of DLR has a question here, mainly around the evolution of airframes, which in terms of UAVs. So given your experience with the UAV market and looking at some of the pictures in your presentation, they were, I would say, quasi-regular kind of shapes. I've seen ones, for instance, that Airbus have brought recently, which is like a swing, a kind of a broad wing aircraft and stuff like that. How do you think airframe design is going to evolve, particularly if you're moving into more of a UAV market?
Yeah, so I think the fundamental requirement spec is different, and so it is unsurprising that the sort of geometry, the optimum geometry, changes. And you've got quite a big discontinuity, which means sort of evolved. There's an opportunity to break with evolved designs. I think you make an interesting observation about our aircraft. They are very conventional looking, very undramatic from that perspective. And that is a very, very conscious decision on our part, which is we think that the success of this has far more to do with integration with the ANSP, the right communication systems, the right procedures with your pilots so that they understand how to interact with manned traffic in a safe way. And that, our industry is built by guys like myself who are aeronautical engineers. And so the first thing we want to do is go and design the aircraft. Actually, that's not the challenge for us. The aircraft design will come, it is coming. What is much, much more important is that integration with ANSPs, the safety case, how we get the regulatory structures in place, electronic conspicuity, procedures, all that kind of thing. And that's what you're seeing in the photos of FlyLogic's aircraft.
Okay. So Hugh, Martin Hawley has a question here. How important are the operational efficiency improvements that can be achieved in the short term through air traffic management and simply better flight planning and agility by air operators? So do you think it's some of these operational efficiencies are better, or do you think it also has to be married in with better planning and agility by the air operators as well?
I think it's probably a bit of both, if I could say that.
Right.
Certainly from the operator side, we continually looking at ways of improving our operational capabilities, so and planning. So it's if we look back a few years ago, we were very involved in developing the CDU, controlled descent approaches, CDAs rather, which really shortened off flights tremendously. If you compare to daylight, bearing in mind a lot of the flying we do, most of it is at night. If you compared that to what similar aircraft are doing in the day, it was massive. And then you put the fuel charges and all that against it. So we became a lot more efficient in that example. So I think we're going to have to look at things like that as well in association, as I said earlier, Philip, with yourselves.
Okay. And from a European perspective, we've heard Eric's view on the interactions with the FAA. From a safety and regulatory point of view, how do you see things progressing on this side of the pond, so to speak, with the regulators and in terms of safety cases? How do you see that interaction going? Do you think we've already started to make some progress on it?
Is that for me?
Yes, that's for you, Hugh.
Yeah. So no, I think absolutely, Philip. I think it's important to work very closely with the regulators, and the cross-pollination between what's happening in the US and other parts of the world is vital in terms of building a case. So I think we're making progress in that regard, and it's interesting learning from people like Eric and the experiences they have, as well as through our esteemed clients in the US, what they do there, and we transition it across here, is very important. And again, one looks back at things like RVSM controls and things like that have been developed. It's a crisscross, it's got to be a global approach to these things. And we see it in other areas, even if we operate an airline in Southeast Asia, similarly, yeah.
Okay. So, Eric, just going back to, I was interested to look at some of your new potential clients for or electric. I have a question here from Vic. With the current unmanned flights, what kind of payloads are we talking about here? Let's take it more near term and then a little bit more. What's your view on that?
Sure. Well, I think, everybody's many people have been trying to build electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft so that you could take off from a tennis court or a heliport. Those require a lot of energy, and payloads get reduced when you use up all your energy taking off and landing. So that sort of holy grail is to be able to do that and do it frequently in a robust commercial market. What we're looking at with with our customers, for example, XTI and Airflow, is a 500-pound payload. One is unmanned and one is manned. And I think they're both thinking about different use cases and different regulatory environments, one for military, one for commercial. And the commercial one, they're starting with a manned aircraft. They'll move to unmanned as that becomes available in terms of the maturation of that technology. But I think starting small, except in the case of the aircraft that we're working on, that is a heavy lift cargo, and it's designed to do operations where we don't have airport infrastructure. But I guess just to back up a second to the 10,000 foot level, distributed electric propulsion offers you the chance to put thrust anywhere you want to on an airframe. So you can, as Charles mentioned, you could put sort of thrust anywhere and have different mission profiles. And so as these aircraft come to certification, we're going to see them in use cases we never thought possible. And it really is kind of one of the most exciting time that I've ever seen in my lifetime in aviation.
Okay. So, Eric, going back to issues, I have a question here from Marius Gauthier. How could we expect unmanned cargo delivery or how could we expect it to arrive in urban areas? So, what would be the first, just to cause a bit of controversy there? What were the first relevant business cases in congested areas? When do you think we could see that?
We can pull out our crystal ball and make sort of predictions, but I think it depends. I think it really depends on whether or not we can make aircraft that are quiet enough that people, the public, can tolerate. And so in terms of urban conditions, how do we have those package deliveries, say the final mile deliveries, around people? And I think that's going to take longer to develop than the sort of middle mile logistics, the 2 to 20 mile feeder routes from SeaTac out to Bremerton, a little feeder facility, sure. And then they take it on trucks the rest of the way. So I'm hesitant to hazard a guess, but we see that sort of happening that way. Maybe Charles has a better answer because he's looking at that very specifically.
Charles, with the hot potato comes to you.
That's very kind, Philip. I think Eric is absolutely right that actually, when you get into real operations, some of the social issues are actually paramount in that, and even we have seen that in just considerations around the impact you have on migrating birds, not just people. And these things are important when you're doing high frequency operations, servicing every day, going back and forward. So, absolutely, you can make a safety case to deliver something. We are operating routinely around large offshore energy installations where where the safety challenges are significant. But I think Eric's right that the sort of you need the combination of demand and social acceptance before you're going to see lots of these vehicles moving into central urban areas quickly.
So, Charles, just while you're on there, you mentioned about ANSPs and the integration into ANSPs. I know I'm familiar with some of the work we're doing in César in integration and ATM. What do you see as the key issues, looking from the NSP perspective, in terms of dealing with drones and unmanned vehicles, and how do you see that actually evolving?
Well, our experience has been you have to work very closely. So our aircraft behave in slightly different ways. You know, they move at different speeds. They're typically moving slightly slower. The controllers have to be comfortable that we are responding in a way. There are lots of practical considerations that we are operating in a way that fits into their operation, and so you end up with a joint safety case. You can't really just sort of draw a nice neat line and split it out. And so we think that that's an evolution that will happen over time. I think there's quite a lot of people that just want to stick a technology solution, you know, some form of detect and avoid into the middle. And that's just not going to be the way to do it. It's going to be a tight integration, an evolution of standards between those two groups that allow us to do it well.
Okay. You going back to the issue of, as you know, hydrogen has been proposed by the European Union, and we have our 2050 and 2035 vision. What's the cargo industry view on the hydrogen versus electric versus SAF discussion? Do you see any particular favorites in terms of that, or what's your kind of overview in terms of a market analysis of it?
I think it's pretty much a stepping stone approach, where first is going to be SAF. SAF's going to have to get us to a point where we're meeting the bridge. But the longer term has to be, I think, hydrogen and coupled with electric. And I'm not just saying that for Eric, but I think there's very much a play between the electric and the hydrogen aspect. But SAF definitely first. That's where it sits. Eric,
what's your view on that, Eric?
Yeah, I think Hugh is right. I think we have these aircraft that are huge assets that last for 30 years, and we're going to need to utilize them for much of their lifespan. And SAFs are the right bridge, if you will. Hydrogen may be the a longer term solution for those large aircraft, and electric propulsion, I think, will come along, but it's a long ways off for those airline transport category aircraft. And again, it'll grow organically from the small end of the market up as we build these technologies and that energy storage and release technology.
Okay, very good. And in terms of timelines, do you see 2030? I mean, they're talking about 2035, for instance, to have the first hydrogen aircraft. Do you think that's realistic, or do you think it's something that's, again, putting you on the spot?
Yeah, that's a good guess. Aviation is really hard. We want to innovate, and we have a lot of good brains working on these issues, and that's part of the reason why we're doing the Forever Flight Alliance, is to really focus our brains and our industry on these issues, so that we can apply levers and help accelerate that change. For example, using prize philanthropy, like my grandfather was after when he flew across the Atlantic, and then X Prize. Those can really help accelerate that change. But in terms of predicting when,
it's a bit of a challenge.
I think it's easier to just push on those technologies and help them move faster.
Okay. Charles, can I go back to you on the point of regulation? You will have seen that EASA have published a use-based regulation recently, and there's been a lot of work done in that area. How do you see that evolving? Do you think that the environment is conducive, shall we say, to development, or are we in a good space on that, or how's that? What's your opinion on it?
Yeah, so I think we're quite outspoken. We very consciously, so we believe a safe operation is in absolutely everyone's interest, and therefore we concentrated in an area where there's a lot of aviation traffic and there's an experienced, demanding regulator, and we believe that's to everyone's advantage. I think it is fundamentally challenging for the regulator because you've got an evolving situation. You know, as Eric referred to, it's a really exciting time. There's a lot of stuff changing very quickly, and that by its nature for a regulator is difficult because you've not got sort of stable standards in that environment. But you know, I can only report sort of praise for the regulator in the United Kingdom, where they seem to strike that balance, and it is a very, very difficult balance. So, you know, they're learning, we're learning. I think they're driving the right types of behaviour. But you know, you're right, Philip. It is a tension because it's fundamentally a difficult thing to balance off, like any technology intensive area.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it's the speed of change that's actually creating the challenge in terms of how we do this. And what's interesting about this discussion is that what we have here is a very disruptive technology. It's not the normal incremental changes which we have in terms of how it works. So Hugh, if I go back then to think about the partnership and the vision, given that you're looking at what's really a very disruptive type of technology, how do you see, Hugh, that the partnership itself? What elements do you have to build into the vision to make cargo to deliver the kind of changes which are obviously needed?
I think from the forum point of view, it's very important that we show leadership and direction, determination going forward. Very importantly, I don't think we can be focused just on compliance or the convention, the latest convention. You really have to, as I said earlier, be very much in touch with what the clientele, our clientele, are expecting, or what's happening in the industry in terms of revolutionary deliverables, that we can follow that very closely, as I say, by being leaders in the industry, not just being compliant.
Okay. And just post-COVID, I mean, taking out your crystal ball and looking into the future, and given that you're one of the few industries that haven't been as badly affected as the rest, how do you think air cargo in a general sense, the level of increase, how much do you think it's going to continue to evolve? Do you think that demand is, I mean, the last numbers I saw yesterday, for instance, was that air cargo was up 9%, for instance, on this time in 2019. So it still seems to be on an upward curve. Do you still think that's still going to be the case? How do you see that evolving, given your discussions with the other industry partners, for instance, and people that you work for?
We see that, and I think the cargo industry sees it as continuing to increase. Probably not at the same rapid rate that it did, but I think we're off a different jump-off point.
Yeah.
And I think things like eventually when passenger airliners start flying again in anger, there's going to be a return to belly hold cargo. And
right.
If you think about it, a lot of the growth that we've seen has actually been from belly holds. And you've got these P freighters flying around as well, which are A330s and what have you, passenger airplanes without
any passengers. Yeah.
Yeah. But basically they're flying that kind of cargo. But those days are going to be over. But then we can't be ignorant and assume that the 777s and the 330s aren't going to come back, because they carry massive loads of cargo. But I think the convention around how people buy, how the way industries changed because of, in a positive way with COVID, the trajectory will continue to be upward. But I think we have to caution ourselves, as I say, looking at things like the return of passenger aircraft in anger, probably around 2023 or so is what the IATA guys and so forth are saying. So it'll take a while.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Eric, what's the perspective in the US? Do you think it's going to come back quicker than we think? Do you think people will be keen to get back? Is there going to be a huge pent-up demand where people will be kind of really keen to get back and flying and stuff? What's your view?
Yeah, I think there is a huge pent-up demand, and people are going to want to move around the planet. That's key. Whether or not that comes back with a bang and then tails off a little bit is a good question. So it's hard to predict accurately, but we had these big pilot shortages. You know, I think there's going to be some other constraints that are going to be interesting to navigate through. And I guess I was reflecting as you were talking, Hugh, and I was just reflecting how fortunate we feel to be a part of ASL's vision with Cargo Vision, because it takes the whole ecosystem of regulators and entrepreneurs and operators and your customers really operating together to make this happen. I think it's, you know, as an entrepreneur, you're always worried about the finances to get through certification. And so it's great to have partners who recognize your value and potential for disruption. I bet Charles feels the same way with FlyLogix.
Charles, what's your view on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, the things that Eric is talking about will be absolutely vital to our systems. You know, we will want to go electric in the very near term. All of the larger issues of the integrated supply chain that Hugh talks about is critical. You can't do it in isolation. You have to carve out a niche where you offer value and then work with other thoughtful groups like Cargo Vision.
Okay. So Hugh, I couldn't not mention in any discussion on this in terms of Cargo Vision and the future, and given it's a test bed for UAVs and pilotless aircraft, where do you see pilots in the ecosystem in this, and what role will the human play in the future in terms of not just cargo industry, but perhaps ultimately in general?
I think we'll see a need for us to be constructive and supportive, if you will, to the pilot industry as a whole, because if we go autonomous, as we're looking at in terms of economics, there definitely are going to be perhaps less pilots flying around in airplanes. But I think Charles actually covered it pretty well earlier on. You know, who's going to control these aircraft? There are a lot of complexities around managing aircraft and airspace, for one, let alone the handling aspects. So I think also, you know, apart from Charles, interesting to hear Charles' point, but we're actually engaging with another one of the forum participants around this very issue to say, you know, we see a definite role for you guys to play in this or other aspect of autonomous flying. So you couldn't do that without being a pilot. So the pilot training aspect doesn't go away. It stays there. I think there's also a factor, whatever it is, in terms of the number of pilots that are grounded at the moment because of the lack of passenger flying. There's going to be obviously a flow away from that industry. People go into other industries, and I've got a young brother who's A380 captain with a particular Middle East airline, and he's been furloughed, and he said, well, I'm going to go and do something else. I ain't going to wait 4 years before they start maybe flying 380s again. So I think you know those are the kinds of things that are going to happen. But there's a responsibility, I think, with all of us to look at how best we use, you know, a fundamental resource, which is the flying personnel going forward. Charles, I don't know if you wanted to touch on that a bit from what you said earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So pilot skill, even in a situation where you have a degree of autonomy, pilot skill still sits at the heart of what we do. So we will have more aircraft flying, more smaller aircraft flying, but they still all need to be managed by humans. And, you know, that's reflected if you look at our team. As an example, one of my pilots is a A340 first officer, and the skills he has are directly relevant to his job looking after these unmanned systems.
Okay. Yeah, it's very, very similar to a conversation we've been having internally about artificial intelligence. And I think the kind of theme that's emerging is that the the automation part is really a support into the system, and it's how it complements the role of the human, and that I think is the challenge in terms of how it evolves.
Absolutely.
Very good. Okay, so I'm just conscious I'm up against the clock at this stage. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it, but unfortunately it comes to an end. I think it's been, we've touched on some really interesting things here, but I think we'll plan to have some follow-up technical webinars perhaps to start to go into a little bit more detail on some of the issues here, because we've had a lot of questions from people, and I know that we will try and get back to you if we can. If you can mark your questions for you, Charles or Eric, or if it's for everybody, we'll try and respond to you if I haven't managed to get to your questions. And if I haven't, I'd like to apologize. So at this stage, I think it really just remains for me to say thank you to the panel for a fascinating discussion. It's been really interesting, and also to all of the people who put in questions into it. So again, it's been very good, and I think we have definitely going to pick up some themes on this, perhaps touching on some of the other areas in cargo vision with some of the other members whom you perhaps mentioned earlier on, to talk about different aspects and how we would integrate all of that together. So it only falls to me to thank the panel, and just to remind you to stay tuned for our next webinars. We have two coming up, one dealing with aviation's impact on non-CO2 emissions, which I know is a very interesting and evolving area. And then the other one is about connecting airports to build back better. So it only remains again to thank the panel and to wish all the participants well. And I hope you all stay safe, and talk to you all very soon. And thanks again from Eurocontrol and from the panel. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks,
Much
guys.
appreciated.
That's very good. And listen, well done to everybody. It was excellent. It was really interesting. Very good. And we will upload your presentations on the website if you can give them to us in PDF. And we will, I'll pass on any questions on that, but I think